It was at the summer camp when I was 15 that I decided to study painting. I went to 6 different art schools over a period of about 8 or 9 years. And I was always looking for the right art school. And it was the 70s, it was the late 60s and early 70s. It was the time of the student strikes in the United States, the Vietnam War, and there was, all the curriculum in the art schools had been thrown out the window. It was sort of a free-for-all. I wanted to find a school that would really teach me technique and teach me drawing and technique, and it was not really being taught at that point. It was much more of a do what you want sort of situation. And then I finally found the school in New York called the New York Studio School of Painting and Sculpture, and that was really the only time that I felt that I was at the right place at the right time. And it was a very rigorous school that was based on the theory of Hans Hofmann. And it was very much a school about drawing. Everything was placed in the context of drawing and understanding spatial concepts of drawing. Drawing is the language of painting. Drawing is the alphabet of painting, and so you have to find a way to draw it, and then you can somehow find a way to paint it. And this one is Girl with a Hand Mirror from the Dreamer series. And these 2 little ones are also from the first version of the Dreamer series. The most important dichotomy in my work is the issue of being on one hand a child of abstract expressionism, which is what I am. I was born in the period of just post-abstract expressionist concept and the beginning of minimalism. And then on the other hand, wanting to be a figure painter, wanting to paint the figure and wanting to paint the figure with some kind of accuracy, and how to reconcile the issues of accuracy and abstract expressionism. And I think that I've really been going back and forth inside of that flip-flop, that ping-pong for 30 years. And I finally sort of have made peace with it and said, this is never going to stop. This is my dialectic. This is what I have to come to terms with in my work. It's never going to change. And as a result of that, my work flips between being gestural and open and having some mark of the brushstroke, having some mark of the touch. And then it flips into a tighter mode where I'm more dependent on the photograph and the work loses any concept of touch, of the gesture, of the brushstroke.
I know Susan, first of all, through her work. I get the feeling like sometimes in some of these works, it's like going to the theater. There's something universal that's going on, a drama that's being played out in an instant. This, from the series of Blind Man's Buff, she is portraying a moment, as she does in all of her work, where there's some sort of tension, maybe just psychological, or it might be ouvert, like this, an open kind of tension. And once again, the treatment is doing this push-pull with the content. The expressiveness of that face just blows me away. The violence, the anger, the strain, the fact that the fist is clenched right in dead center of the canvas, the cataclysmic color scheme of the fiery red to the disturbed heavens. The application of the paint on the surface is so much fun and free. It has staying power.
I call myself a narrative painter. I'm a storyteller. And inside of that narrative, there's a psychological issue that's happening inside of the image that the viewer can participate in, and that hopefully there's more than one resolution. And this is from a very different period of Fragments series. They get very different surface I was exploring at the time.
That's the thing about Susan's work. You look at it and you stay there and you keep looking at it and you keep discovering things. And I think that's the big challenge of painters today, is to hold a viewer's attention for a longer period. So they see and appreciate what's going on in a narrative, in the way it's treated in a painterly fashion. That's what I enjoy about it, basically.
I read the Cocteau book, Les Enfants Terribles, in high school. 20 years later, I ended up reading it again, and it had the same dynamic impact on me as it had earlier. And I was very surprised about that until I realized that the story was kind of about these teenagers who were living on the lam, who were really orphans. They were outside of the laws of nature and man. They were living on their own. They had nobody to look over and see that they were doing okay. And it was all cloaked in Cocteau's poetic image of Paris in 1930. I took this story, but then I completely rewrote the story by choosing certain images and making scenes out of certain images, and in that way losing the original context and providing a secondary context. This painting, called My Brother's Body, is the moment at the very beginning of the story when the brother is hurt by a snowball in a very innocent moment. And it's that innocence of that snowball fight and him becoming ill and him leaving school that sets up the whole drama of the story. And in here on the wall, I have enlarged one of the studies for that painting. The drawings were really the point of departure, trying to find a way into the story, trying to find some images. It's always a question of finding images that have their own resonance. These are facsimiles of pieces of notebooks that I kept as I was working on trying to find which images I would make into paintings. I thought it was very important to have the notebooks available to the public. For me, drawing is always the source of everything. Everything comes from drawing. And I feel that for a viewer to see the working process of an artist, it is a wonderful way of demystifying how something ends up appearing on a wall. Where is the viewer in relation to the image is a very, is something I've been thinking about for years. So I think the drama of these wall paintings is a way of pulling the viewer into the story of the paintings themselves. It's so great to have something that's so big that when you stand next to it, you realize how the scale really changes the relationship of how the viewer sees the image and how the viewer can enter the painting, and all of a sudden the neighbor of that takes on a different aura. This room is described as being the heart of the relationship of the brother and sister in the book. And the room is a mess, and it's got stuff everywhere, and it's shrouded in this, very often they put a red scarf over the lamps to sort of cut down on the light. And so I decided after painting that to throw that one wall in red would increase the atmosphere. It pulls the wall drawings into the paintings by having the red reoccur with the red in the drawings and the red on the wall, and so the reds kind of have a kind of a passion to them. Technically, I'd say these paintings were done quite quickly. They were done with underpaintings, white underpaintings, and a very specific colored ground. I tried very much to have a very specific light and a very specific mood in each piece. I wanted the viewer to like some much more than others, so that it wasn't an equal. I like this one, but I don't like that one, and why, and to set up that kind of an arrangement. I've always wanted my paintings to be accessible. I've always sort of rebelled against the idea that painting is only for artists, and that painting, you have to know the language of painting to be involved with painting. I've always really felt that I didn't subscribe to that school. So I think all along I've always tried to choose stories, narrative, to create paintings around where the viewer would feel like they could participate in that story. They could relate to that story. They could put themselves in the story. And whether or not you understand the source of the narrative, in the end, it doesn't really matter, because the paintings end up having a life of their own, I hope. I did my first major series in 1983 called Description of a Struggle, which was from a short story by Franz Kafka. And I took the text of Franz Kafka from a parable, a short story, and I rewrote that story and made it my own.
Why I was attracted to her work in the first place, it starts for me with this series. Her use of the white borders really appealed to me. She was dealing with very difficult subject matter in a way, violent situations perhaps, not always, but always a very human drama is going on. The way she treats it is in a very open, a loose way of painting, I would call it. And the unpredictable color combinations make it almost comic book-like. There's a freshness to it. And it seems to be like a freshness that pulls in the opposite direction of the subject that she's portraying.
One of my most important teachers, whose name was Sidney Tillum, said there's only two issues for a painter. What are you going to paint, and how are you going to paint it? That's it. There's only two questions. And everything that you do in your studio falls into one of the two categories. What are you going to paint, and how are you going to paint it? How are you going to paint it, the issue of technique, is another issue that has kept me very busy for 30 years. This painting on my right is an example of the paintings in the 80s that have no underpainting, that are painted a la prima, and that have the white border with a text. In this case, it says, "What is likely to happen to him?" And that's how I painted for over 20 years. The difference between the glazing technique is that you have a sense of transparent layers of color over this white there's a pink, and over the pink there's a darker red, and behind it all is the underpainting very dark color that was laid in. There's marble dust in here to build up the surface. It gives a texture to the paint. as opposed to this one, which is completely flat, completely smooth to the surface. There's no glazing. There's no transparency to build up the color. So the light in this is like a reflected light. The light bounces off of that, while as in the glazed paintings, the light sort of comes from behind. And that's the old technique of old master painting. I think that as a painter, I am very involved, for example, in old master painting. I'm very, very involved with looking and studying narrative paintings of Goya, Velázquez, Giotto, Tiepolo. My life as a painter is extremely involved with, still now, looking for inspiration, looking for figure composition, looking for technique from painters. The Blind Man's Buff series, which really all came from a single image of the Goya painting, Blind Man's Buff. So the series is really about seeing what one wants to see and not seeing what one doesn't want to see in life. In that series, it was the first time that instead of doing hundreds of small drawings that were gouache on paper, I did maybe 50 paintings about this size that were studies. The painting on the right is egg oil emulsion. It's very dry. And the drawing on the left is pretty much a la prima, with a little bit of texture underneath from paint. But it's a good example, in fact, of that moment when my technique was beginning to change between a la prima and underpainting with egg oil emulsion.
An artist of her caliber, that is an artist that can, in a series of quick lines, give you a sense of authority. She has a sense of authority when she paints. That authority gives credibility to the work. And it allows her to do whatever she wants to do without fear that it's going to come out looking like a Susan Scott.
I'm trying to figure out a gesture, an image that I can superimpose over the painting so that it's not just the head, but there's a second reading. And I'm not sure which images are going to work as overlays. I'm not sure what size.
For the positioning and
the size.
And the size.
I'm thinking of putting it over him. This, you know, there's this pull between the bird and the man and the...
I see.
I'm not sure if that could work here. And I'm not sure about the naivety of this overlay and the sophistication of the drawing.
If you look through the catalogs, and you understand the adventurousness of Susan Scott. She's willing to explore further. She's not willing to stop and do series of paintings and work which are suitable for hanging in the home. It's more than that for her. It's very personal. And it takes her in faraway places and brings us back home.
My formative years as a painter in New York were still incredibly dominated by the male persona. I mean, abstract expressionism is nothing if not macho in its very being. The whole icon of the male, gestural, Jackson Pollock, de Kooning. I mean, these were guys, you know, these were men painting and drinking beer and meeting with other men, and it was a very, very masculine world. I've taught in over 8 universities across Canada, and it's very important for me to be a role model for my students. It's very important that students see me and see me as a painter with a career and as a mother with a career as a painter and also as a teacher. I had one female teacher in the 6 art schools that I went to. They were all men. So that is tremendously changed now. If you go to any university, over half of the faculty is women. There are a great number of women involved in the art world, and Canada is very generous with its women artists.
So these two, which are
These
pair,
are studies, yeah.
They would be a diptych or more, or?
I don't know.
So these are studies for this whole
The whole
wall.
thing is just in transition, in its very, very beginning stage.
Mm-hmm.
Already, you know, from this format to this format,
Mm-hmm.
I've given much more ground around the figure, so there's more space.
Yeah.
As a teacher, I want to have students understand the relationship of art history, which most don't, you know. I mean, students come into the classroom and they don't want to look at art history, they don't want to look at what's going on in the museums. They say, no, 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 I'm going to do it myself, and I don't want to be influenced. I mean, that's the line that all students feel. It's very important for me to somehow kindle an interest in art history and trying to teach students how to take what they need from old painting. 1% of my students will become a professional painter, but the rest of them will become articulate, informed art viewers. And they are the ones that will be the intelligentsia in the Canadian art world in 10 years or 20 years. They're the ones that might have money to go out and make a Canadian art market and invest in Canadian painting and have the confidence to buy because they know what's good, which is, of course, the difference between not having the confidence to buy Canadian work because people don't feel that it's good enough.
I'm eager to see what it's going to look like when this is a paint that
I'm terrified.
Is lying on that surface.
I'm terrified about doing that. You only have one shot.
You only have one shot.
You only have one shot, so you got to really practice and make sure you know that your drawing is right on. And if you look at the life of an artist, the whole work is one roll of paper or one, like a Japanese screen. And the entire life is that piece, that one piece. And whether it goes on for 30 years or 40 years or 50 years, it's really one piece. And there are stronger parts of that piece and weaker parts of that piece, but it's the piece that's interesting. It's the life of the artist that's the interesting thing. I would hope that people would look at my work as a continuum. A dear friend of mine once said, when they're not inspired, they have to go to the studio anyway, because if the angel of inspiration happens to visit and you're not in the studio working, then what's going to happen? So you have to be there in case the angel decides to visit you. And then at least you're rewarded with inspiration.